Welcome to History for Snooze. Every page of history holds the footprints of time, the voices of choirs in candlelit halls, the gentle notes of lutes and harps, and the rhythms that once echoed through bustling marketplaces. Here, we will travel back to the past, slowly, gently, so we can almost hear the melodies of another era. Tonight, our story drifts into the enchanting world of medieval music, from sacred chants that lifted spirits in grand cathedrals, to lively folk songs that carried joy through taverns and village squares. These sounds reveal not only the art of the time, but the heartbeat of medieval life itself. Before we start, dim the lights, settle into a comfortable spot, and let the world outside fade away. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your small gesture is my greatest inspiration to keep telling these stories. And in the comments, let me know where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. Now, close your eyes and join me on this quiet journey, where history is not just a record of events, but a soft-spoken story that will guide you toward peace, and maybe even toward sleep. Medieval music, spanning roughly from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE to the beginning of the Renaissance around 1400 CE, represents one of the most transformative periods in the history of Western musical development. This era witnessed the birth of musical notation, the evolution of polyphony, and the establishment of many fundamental principles that would influence music for centuries to come. The medieval period saw music transition from purely oral tradition to a sophisticated written art form, laying the groundwork for all subsequent Western classical music. The foundation of medieval music, plainchant and early Christian worship. The earliest medieval music was dominated by plainchant, also known as Gregorian chant, which emerged from the liturgical practices of the early Christian Church. This monophonic sacred song, characterized by its free-flowing melodies without strict meter, served as the foundation upon which much of medieval musical development would build. Pope Gregory I, who reigned from 590 to 604 CE, is traditionally credited with organizing and codifying the vast repertoire of chant, though modern scholarship suggests that the systematization occurred over several centuries rather than during his papacy alone. The chant melodies were passed down through oral tradition for centuries, with regional variations developing across different parts of Europe, including Roman, Gallican, Mozarabic, and Ambrosian chant traditions. The liturgical context of plainchant cannot be overstated in its importance to medieval musical development. The 8 canonical hours of prayer, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, provided a structured framework within which chant developed and flourished. Each service required specific chants appropriate to its liturgical function, creating a vast repertoire that encompassed thousands of individual melodies. The proper of the Mass, containing chants that varied according to the church calendar, and the ordinary of the Mass, with its fixed texts including the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei, established categories that would remain central to Western sacred music throughout history. The modal system underlying plainchant represented a sophisticated approach to melodic organization that derived from ancient Greek theory while adapting to Christian liturgical needs. The 8 church modes, Dorian, Hypodorian, Phrygian, Hypophrygian, Lydian, Hypolydian, Mixolydian, and Hypomixolydian, provided distinct scalar patterns that created different emotional and spiritual atmospheres within the chant repertoire. Each mode possessed its own final tone and reciting tone, creating melodic patterns that became deeply ingrained in Western musical consciousness. The theoretical understanding of these modes, codified in treatises by theorists such as Hucbald of St. Amand and later refined by writers like Guido of Arezzo, provided a systematic approach to melodic composition that influenced music far beyond the medieval period. The performance practice of plain chant involved complex traditions of vocal technique and liturgical coordination that were transmitted through intensive training within monastic and cathedral schools. The development of specialized roles within chant performance, including cantors, schola cantorum, and congregational participation, created sophisticated performance traditions that varied significantly between different regions and religious orders. The acoustic environments of medieval churches, with their long reverberation times and stone construction, profoundly influenced both the composition and performance of chant, leading to the development of musical techniques that exploited these architectural characteristics. The spiritual and theological dimensions of chant. The spiritual significance of plain chant extended far beyond its functional role in liturgical services, embodying theological concepts that were central to medieval Christian thought. The modal structures of chant were understood to reflect different aspects of divine nature and human spiritual experience, with specific modes considered appropriate for different liturgical seasons and feast days. The concept of chant as prayer in musical form created performance traditions that emphasized spiritual contemplation and communal worship over individual expression or artistic display. The relationship between text and melody in plain chant reflected sophisticated understanding of the ways in which musical elements could enhance and interpret sacred texts. The use of melismatic passages at key textual moments created opportunities for extended musical meditation on important theological concepts, while syllabic settings ensured clear textual comprehension during rapid passages of liturgical action. The development of different melodic formulas for different types of liturgical texts, including antiphons, responsories, hymns, and psalm tones, created a comprehensive system of musical rhetoric that supported effective liturgical communication. The manuscript tradition of chant preservation reveals important aspects of medieval attitudes toward musical authority and authenticity. The efforts to create uniform chant books throughout different regions and religious orders reflected concerns about maintaining correct liturgical practice while accommodating local traditions and preferences. The development of systems for indicating variant readings and performance practices in chant manuscripts demonstrates sophisticated approaches to preserving both stability and flexibility in liturgical performance. The revolutionary development of musical notation. The development of musical notation during the medieval period represented a revolutionary advancement in the preservation and transmission of musical knowledge. The earliest forms of notation, called neumes, appeared in the 9th century as simple marks placed above text to indicate the general direction of melodic movement. These primitive notational symbols evolved from the accent marks used in classical Latin poetry and rhetoric, representing humanity's first systematic attempt to preserve musical information in written form. The transition from purely oral transmission to written notation marked one of the most significant developments in the history of Western music, enabling the preservation and standardization of musical repertoires that had previously existed only in the memories of performers. Guido of Arezzo, a Benedictine monk working in the early 11th century, made crucial contributions to the development of musical notation by introducing the use of staff lines and establishing the foundation for the system of psalmization that would eventually evolve into the modern do-re-mi system. His innovations allowed for precise pitch notation, making it possible to accurately preserve and transmit complex melodies across great distances and through time. The Guidonian hand, a mnemonic device attributed to Guido, enabled singers to visualize the relationships between different pitches and intervals, facilitating the learning and performance of complex melodic passages. This system of pitch relationships became so fundamental to medieval musical education that it remained in use well into the Renaissance period. The evolution of pneumatic notation through various regional traditions created distinct notational dialects that reflected local performance practices and theoretical approaches. The Saint Gall notation of Switzerland, the Léon notation of northern France, and the Beneventan notation of southern Italy each developed unique characteristics that provide valuable insights into medieval performance practices. The gradual standardization of notation through the influence of major centers like the Abbey of Cluny and later the University of Paris created increasingly uniform practices that facilitated the exchange of musical repertoires between different regions and institutions. The development of staff notation represented a crucial breakthrough in achieving precise pitch indication. The evolution from single-line staves to the four-line staff that became standard for chant notation and eventually to the five-line staff that remains standard today, reflected ongoing efforts to balance notational precision with practical usability. The introduction of clefs, particularly the C clef and F clef, provided reference points that allowed singers to determine exact pitches from written notation. These innovations transformed music from a primarily oral art form into a literate tradition that could be taught, learned, and preserved with unprecedented accuracy. The implications of written notation extended far beyond mere preservation of existing melodies. The ability to see musical relationships in visual form enabled composers to conceive and create increasingly complex musical structures that would have been impossible to transmit through oral tradition alone. The development of notation also facilitated theoretical analysis of music, leading to sophisticated systems of musical classification and compositional guidelines that supported the creation of ever more elaborate musical works. The psychological and cultural impact of notation. The development of musical literacy through notation systems created fundamental changes in how medieval musicians understood and conceptualized musical relationships. The visual representation of melodic motion enabled new approaches to musical analysis and composition that were impossible within purely oral traditions. The ability to compare different musical works through written notation facilitated the development of systematic compositional techniques and theoretical understanding that supported increasingly sophisticated musical creation. The democratizing effect of musical notation enabled broader participation in complex musical traditions by reducing the memory burden required for musical performance. While the most elaborate chant repertoires had previously been accessible only to specialists with exceptional memories and years of training, written notation made it possible for musicians with more modest abilities to participate in sophisticated musical performances. This expansion of musical literacy contributed to the growth of musical institutions and the development of larger and more complex musical ensembles. The standardization of musical notation across different regions and institutions created new possibilities for musical communication and collaboration that transcended geographical and political boundaries. The development of common notational practices enabled musicians trained in different traditions to work together effectively and facilitated the rapid spread of musical innovations throughout medieval Europe. This standardization also supported the development of international musical styles that incorporated influences from various regional traditions. The birth and evolution of polyphony. The rise of polyphony in the medieval period marked a fundamental shift from the monophonic tradition of early Christian chant to the complex multi-voiced compositions that would define much of Western art music. The earliest forms of polyphony, known as organum, emerged in the 9th and 10th centuries, initially consisting of a plain chant melody accompanied by one or more additional voices moving in parallel motion. The Winchester troper, dating from around 1000 CE, contains some of the earliest examples of written polyphonic music, though the notation is too primitive to allow for accurate modern reconstruction. As organum developed, composers began experimenting with contrary and oblique motion between voices, creating increasingly sophisticated harmonic relationships. The theoretical foundations of early polyphony were established through treatises such as the Musica Enchiriadis and Scalica Enchiriadis, anonymous 9th-century works that provided the first systematic descriptions of polyphonic composition. These treatises introduced concepts of consonance and dissonance that would remain fundamental to Western harmonic theory, establishing the perfect consonances of unison, octave, fourth, and fifth as the primary building blocks of polyphonic composition. The gradual acceptance of the third as a consonance during the later medieval period represented a crucial development that would eventually lead to the harmonic practices of the Renaissance and beyond. The school of Notre Dame in Paris, flourishing during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, became the epicenter of polyphonic innovation during the medieval period. Léonin and Periton, the two master composers associated with this school, developed the art of organum to unprecedented heights of complexity and beauty. Léonin's Magnus Liber Organi provided elaborate two-voice settings for the major feasts of the church year, while Periton expanded these works to include 3 and 4 voices, creating some of the most magnificent polyphonic compositions of the entire medieval period. Their innovations in rhythmic notation allowed for the precise coordination of multiple independent melodic lines, establishing principles of rhythmic organization that would influence Western music for centuries. The organa of the Notre Dame school demonstrated sophisticated approaches to formal organization that would influence polyphonic composition throughout the medieval period and beyond. The technique of discant, in which all voices moved in roughly equal note values, alternated with passages of sustained note organum in which the chant melody was extended into long-held notes while upper voices moved in more active rhythmic patterns. This alternation created dramatic contrasts of texture and rhythm that enhanced the liturgical function of these works while demonstrating remarkable compositional skill. The development of clausuli, self-contained polyphonic sections that could be substituted for portions of larger organa, represented an important innovation in medieval compositional practice. These interchangeable musical modules allowed for flexibility in performance while providing composers with opportunities to experiment with different approaches to text setting and polyphonic treatment. The practice of creating multiple clausuli for the same chant segment led to the development of increasingly sophisticated techniques of variation and elaboration that would influence later compositional practices. The rhythmic modes developed by the Notre Dame composers provided the first systematic approach to organizing rhythm in polyphonic music. The 6 rhythmic modes, based on poetic meters from classical antiquity, established patterns of long and short notes that could be applied consistently throughout polyphonic compositions. This system enabled composers to create coherent rhythmic structures in multi-voiced works while providing performers with clear guidelines for coordinating independent melodic lines. The modal rhythmic system represented a crucial step toward the more flexible mensural notation that would develop during the 13th century. The aesthetic and technical challenges of early polyphony. The development of polyphonic composition presented unprecedented technical challenges that required new approaches to musical planning and execution. The coordination of multiple independent melodic lines demanded sophisticated understanding of interval relationships and voice-leading principles that had been unnecessary in monophonic composition. The need to create musical works that maintained coherence and beauty while satisfying complex technical constraints pushed medieval composers to develop increasingly sophisticated compositional techniques. The acoustic challenges of polyphonic performance in medieval architectural settings required careful attention to the relationship between musical texture and architectural acoustics. The long reverberation times characteristic of stone churches created opportunities for rich harmonic resonance but also presented challenges in maintaining clarity between independent voices. Composers learned to exploit these acoustic characteristics through techniques such as antiphonal writing and careful spacing of harmonic intervals to create optimal acoustic effects. The liturgical integration of polyphonic compositions required careful balance between musical elaboration and functional liturgical communication. The extension of liturgical texts through elaborate polyphonic treatment created works of remarkable beauty and complexity, but composers had to ensure that these elaborations enhanced rather than obscured the spiritual and practical functions of liturgical music. The development of techniques for highlighting important textual moments through musical means became an important aspect of medieval compositional practice. The sophistication of mensural notation and 13th century developments. The development of mensural notation during the 13th century, largely attributed to Franco of Cologne, provided composers with the tools necessary to create increasingly complex rhythmic structures. This system established clear relationships between different note values and introduced concepts of perfect and imperfect time that would remain fundamental to Western music theory well into the Renaissance and beyond. The ability to notate precise rhythmic relationships enabled the composition of sophisticated polyphonic works in which multiple voices could maintain independence while creating coherent harmonic progressions. Franco's Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, the art of measurable music, codified the principles of mensural notation and established a theoretical framework that supported the creation of increasingly complex polyphonic compositions. The treatise introduced concepts of perfection and imperfection in note values, relating musical time to theological concepts of divine perfection represented by the number 3. Perfect time involved the division of longer note values into 3 shorter ones, while imperfect time involved division into 2. This system provided flexibility while maintaining theoretical consistency, enabling composers to create works of remarkable rhythmic sophistication. The introduction of 4 basic note shapes, duplex long, breve, and semibreve, provided composers with a vocabulary of rhythmic values that could be combined in various ways to create complex temporal structures. The relationships between these note values could be modified through the use of dots, ligatures, and other notational devices that indicated specific proportional relationships. This system enabled the precise coordination of multiple independent voices while providing sufficient flexibility for expressive rhythmic variation. The concept of perfection in mensural notation extended beyond mere mathematical relationships to encompass theological and philosophical ideas about the nature of time and musical expression. The preference for triple divisions reflected medieval concepts of divine perfection, while the use of imperfect divisions provided opportunities for creating tension and resolution within musical structures. This integration of practical compositional technique with theoretical and theological concepts exemplified the medieval approach to music as both art and intellectual discipline. The development of mensural notation facilitated the emergence of new compositional genres and techniques that would have been impossible under earlier notational systems. The precise control of rhythmic relationships enabled composers to create works in which multiple texts could be set simultaneously in different voices, leading to the development of the motet as a major polyphonic genre. The ability to notate complex rhythmic patterns also supported the development of secular polyphonic genres that incorporated dance rhythms and other vernacular musical elements. The mathematical and philosophical foundations of mensural theory. The theoretical foundations of minstrel notation drew extensively on medieval mathematical and philosophical traditions that emphasized proportional relationships as fundamental principles of cosmic order. The application of mathematical concepts to musical time created systems of rhythmic organization that reflected broader medieval understanding of the relationship between mathematical harmony and divine creation. The integration of practical musical needs with theoretical mathematical principles created notational systems of remarkable sophistication and intellectual coherence. The pedagogical implications of minstrel notation transformed musical education by requiring systematic understanding of mathematical relationships and proportional thinking. The study of minstrel theory became an important component of medieval musical education, requiring students to master complex relationships between different temporal divisions and proportional modifications. This mathematical approach to musical education contributed to the development of increasingly sophisticated theoretical understanding among medieval musicians. The international adoption of Franconian minstrel principles created unprecedented standardization in European musical notation that facilitated musical communication across political and cultural boundaries. The establishment of common notational practices enabled composers and performers from different regions to collaborate effectively and supported the development of international musical styles that transcended local traditions. Secular music and the courtly tradition. Secular music began to flourish during the High Medieval period, particularly through the traditions of the troubadours in southern France, the trouvères in northern France, and the Minnesänger in Germany. These poet-musicians, often of noble birth, created a rich repertoire of courtly songs dealing with themes of love, chivalry, and courtly life. The troubadour tradition, beginning in the late 11th century with figures like Guillaume IX of Aquitaine, established many of the poetic and musical conventions that would influence secular music throughout the medieval period and beyond. Their sophisticated approach to text-music relationships and their development of various poetic forms, including the canso, servante, and alba, provided models that would be adopted and adapted throughout medieval Europe. The cultural context of troubadour music reflects the emergence of courtly culture in medieval Europe and the development of new ideals of romantic love and chivalric behavior. The concept of fin amour, refined love, provided both thematic content and aesthetic framework for troubadour compositions, creating a sophisticated literary and musical tradition that elevated secular love poetry to unprecedented artistic heights. The integration of music and poetry in troubadour songs created unified artistic works in which musical and textual elements were carefully coordinated to achieve maximum expressive effect. The troubadour repertoire encompasses a remarkable variety of forms and styles, ranging from the elaborate cansos with their complex strophic structures to the more direct pastorelas and tensons. The canso, the most prestigious of troubadour forms, typically consisted of 5 to 7 stanzas with a concluding envoy, each stanza following the same complex rhyme scheme and musical setting. The servante employed the melody of an existing canso but substituted satirical or political texts, creating works that commented on contemporary events and personalities. The alba, or dawn song, depicted lovers parting at daybreak, often incorporating the call of a watchman warning of approaching dawn. The musical characteristics of troubadour songs demonstrate sophisticated approaches to melodic construction and text setting that influenced secular music throughout medieval Europe. The melodies typically encompass a range of an octave or slightly more, with careful attention to the relationship between musical phrase structure and poetic line organization. The use of melismatic passages at structurally important points in the text created opportunities for vocal display while highlighting key words and concepts. The modal basis of troubadour melodies provided distinct emotional colorations that complemented the poetic content of the songs. The transmission and preservation of troubadour music present complex problems that illuminate medieval attitudes toward musical notation and performance practice. Many troubadour songs survive without musical notation, preserved only as texts in manuscript collections called chansonniers. The melodies that do survive are notated in various regional systems that often lack clear rhythmic indication, leaving many questions about original performance practices. The relationship between written notation and actual performance was clearly more flexible in secular music than in liturgical contexts, allowing for improvisation and variation that reflected individual performance traditions. The influence of troubadour music extended throughout medieval Europe through various channels, including political marriages, crusading expeditions, and the travels of individual musicians. The trouvère tradition of northern France adapted troubadour forms and conventions to the linguistic and cultural context of the northern French courts, creating a related but distinct tradition that flourished through the 13th century. The Minnesänger tradition in Germany similarly adapted Romance models to Germanic cultural contexts, producing works that combined imported influences with indigenous traditions. The social function of troubadour music within courtly society reveals important aspects of medieval cultural values and social organization. The performance of troubadour songs at courtly gatherings served not only as entertainment but also as a means of affirming social bonds and cultural values. The idealization of noble love and chivalric behavior in troubadour texts provided models for courtly conduct while creating a shared cultural vocabulary that transcended regional political boundaries. The decline of the troubadour tradition during the late 13th century resulted from various factors, including the Albigensian Crusades' disruption of southern French courtly culture and changing literary tastes that favored new forms of vernacular poetry. However, the influence of troubadour music continued through the works of later composers who adapted troubadour melodies for polyphonic settings and through the preservation of troubadour forms in the emerging traditions of Renaissance secular music. The economics and patronage of courtly music. The economic structures that supported troubadour and courtly music reveal important aspects of medieval social organization and cultural values. The patronage systems that enabled poet-musicians to develop their art required significant economic resources and reflected the cultural aspirations of noble patrons who sought to demonstrate their sophistication and refinement through support of artistic endeavors. The economic relationships between patrons and musicians created networks of cultural exchange that facilitated the spread of musical innovations throughout medieval Europe. The professional lives of troubadours and other courtly musicians demonstrate the emergence of new forms of artistic career that combined creative activity with social and political engagement. Many troubadours held important positions in courtly society that extended beyond their musical activities, serving as diplomats, administrators, and political advisors. This integration of artistic and political roles created opportunities for musicians to influence cultural and political developments while pursuing their creative work. The manuscript production associated with courtly music required substantial investments in skilled scribes, illuminators, and materials that reflected the high cultural value placed on these artistic traditions. The luxury manuscripts that preserve troubadour and courtly repertoires demonstrate sophisticated approaches to integrating visual and musical arts that created unified artistic experiences. The economic support required for these productions illustrates the significant resources that medieval patrons were willing to invest in cultural activities. The motet, innovation in polyphonic composition. The rise of the motet during the 13th century represented another crucial development in medieval polyphony. Unlike the liturgical organum of the Notre Dame school, Motets often combined sacred and secular texts in different languages, creating complex layers of meaning and musical structure. The earliest motets developed from the practice of adding texts to the upper voices of existing organum, but the form quickly evolved into an independent compositional genre. These works frequently employed a technique called isorhythm, in which a repeating rhythmic pattern was applied to a melodic line, creating sophisticated structural relationships that demonstrate the medieval fascination with mathematical and symbolic proportions in music. The structural complexity of the medieval motet reflects sophisticated approaches to musical architecture that would influence polyphonic composition throughout the later medieval period and into the Renaissance. The typical 13th century motet consisted of a tenor voice derived from plain chant, over which two or more upper voices presented independent texts and melodies. This polytextual structure created works of remarkable literary and musical complexity, in which multiple levels of meaning could be simultaneously present. The relationships between different textual layers, sometimes complementary, sometimes contrasting, sometimes completely independent, created rich interpretive possibilities that engaged both performers and listeners on multiple levels. The development of isorhythmic technique in 14th century motets represented one of the most sophisticated structural innovations of medieval music. The separation of melodic content, color, from rhythmic pattern, talia, in the tenor voice created systematic organizational principles that could generate extended compositions of remarkable coherence and complexity. When the talia and color were of different lengths, their periodic realignment created large-scale structural articulations that provided formal organization for works that might otherwise seem episodic. The application of isorhythmic principles to upper voices as well as tenors enabled composers to create works of unprecedented structural integration. The textual content of medieval motets reveals important aspects of medieval cultural values and intellectual life. The combination of sacred and secular texts within individual motets reflects the medieval worldview in which spiritual and temporal concerns were intimately connected rather than separate spheres of experience. Political motets commenting on contemporary events demonstrate the genre's capacity to address current issues while maintaining sophisticated artistic standards. The use of multiple languages within single motets, typically Latin for the tenor and vernacular languages for upper voices, reflects the multilingual character of medieval intellectual culture. The notation of medieval motets pushed the boundaries of minstrel notation and contributed to its continuing development. The need to coordinate multiple independent voices with different texts and rhythmic patterns required increasingly sophisticated notational solutions. The development of colored notation, in which different note values were indicated by different colors or shapes, enabled composers to create complex proportional relationships between voices. The use of partial signatures in which different voices had different key signatures allowed for harmonic relationships that would have been impossible under simpler notational systems. The performance context of medieval motets varied considerably depending on their textual content and structural complexity. Liturgical motets were presumably performed during church services, though their specific liturgical function often remains unclear. Secular motets may have been performed at courtly gatherings or in urban settings where educated audiences could appreciate their literary and musical sophistication. The technical demands of motet performance required skilled musicians capable of managing complex rhythmic relationships and multiple simultaneous texts. The international circulation of motet repertoires demonstrates the cosmopolitan character of medieval musical culture. Major manuscript collections like the Montpellier Codex preserve motets by composers from various regions and reveal processes of transmission and adaptation that created truly international repertoires. The influence of French motet composers on English, Italian, and German musical development illustrates the ways in which innovative compositional techniques spread throughout medieval Europe despite political fragmentation and geographical barriers. The intellectual and symbolic dimensions of motet composition. The symbolic and allegorical content of many medieval motets reveals the integration of musical composition with medieval theological and philosophical traditions. The use of number symbolism in structural proportions, the incorporation of biblical and liturgical references in secular contexts, and the creation of complex theological allegories through textual juxtaposition demonstrate the intellectual sophistication expected of both composers and audiences in medieval musical culture. These symbolic dimensions created multiple levels of meaning that rewarded careful study and contemplation. The pedagogical function of motets in medieval educational contexts reveals their role in transmitting both musical and intellectual culture. The analysis of motet structures provided students with models of complex compositional organization, while the study of their textual content offered opportunities for exploring theological, philosophical, and literary concepts. The integration of musical and textual study in motet analysis exemplified medieval approaches to education that emphasized the interconnections between different areas of knowledge. The development of specialized performance traditions for different types of motets created distinct subcategories within the genre that served different social and liturgical functions. Ceremonial motets for important state occasions required different performance approaches from contemplative motets designed for private devotional use. The adaptation of motet performance practices to different acoustic and social environments demonstrates the flexibility of the genre and its capacity to serve diverse cultural functions. The Ars Nova and 14th century musical revolution. The Ars Nova movement of the 14th century, pioneered by composers like Philippe de Vitry and Guillaume de Machaut, marked a significant departure from earlier medieval musical practices. This new art introduced unprecedented rhythmic complexity and expressive freedom, challenging the more restrictive practices of the preceding Ars Antiqua period. Machaut, in particular, stands as one of the towering figures of medieval music, creating masterpieces in both secular and sacred genres. His Messe de Notre Dame represents the first complete polyphonic setting of the Mass Ordinary by a single composer, establishing a model that would be followed by countless Renaissance and later composers. The theoretical foundations of the Ars Nova were established in Philippe de Vitry's treatise of the same name, which introduced revolutionary concepts of rhythmic organization that expanded the possibilities of minstrel notation far beyond the limitations of earlier systems. The recognition of the minim as a standard note value, along with more flexible approaches to the relationships between different minstrel levels, enabled composers to create works of unprecedented rhythmic subtlety and complexity. The development of notation for complex syncopated rhythms and the systematization of proportional relationships between different mensurations provided technical tools that supported new levels of compositional sophistication. Guillaume de Machaut's contributions to both sacred and secular music demonstrate the remarkable artistic achievements possible within the Ars Nova framework. His secular works, including Virelai, Ballades, and Rondo, established models of textual musical integration that influenced vernacular song composition throughout Europe. The structural sophistication of works like Ma fin est mon commencement reveals a composer capable of creating musical palindromes and other complex formal procedures while maintaining expressive immediacy and melodic appeal. His sacred compositions, culminating in the Messe de Notre Dame, demonstrate the application of Ars Nova techniques to traditional liturgical contexts with remarkable artistic success. The Messe de Notre Dame represents a watershed moment in the history of Western music, being the first complete polyphonic mass cycle by a single composer. The work's structural coherence, achieved through careful manipulation of modal relationships and motivic connections between movements, established principles of cyclic mass composition that would remain central to sacred music composition for centuries. The individual movements demonstrate different approaches to polyphonic text setting, from the syllabic clarity of the Gloria to the elaborate melismatic treatment of the Sanctus, showcasing the full range of Ars Nova compositional techniques. The rhythmic innovations of the Ars Nova created new possibilities for musical expression that reflected changing cultural values and aesthetic preferences. The increasing acceptance of duple divisions and complex, syncopated rhythms paralleled developments in vernacular poetry and secular culture that emphasized individual expression and emotional directness over the more anonymous and spiritually focused aesthetic of earlier medieval music. The technical complexity of Ars Nova compositions also reflected the emergence of professional musicians capable of performing works that would have been impossible for earlier generations of amateur performers. The manuscript tradition of Ars Nova music reveals important aspects of 14th-century musical culture and patronage systems. Luxury manuscripts like the Chantilly Codex, with their elaborate illuminations and sophisticated notational systems, demonstrate the high cultural value placed on musical composition and the existence of wealthy patrons capable of supporting such expensive productions. The international circulation of Ars Nova compositions, evidenced by the presence of French works in Italian and English manuscripts, illustrates the cosmopolitan character of late medieval musical culture. The influence of the Ars Nova extended well beyond France to encompass developments in Italian, English, and other European musical traditions. The Italian Ars Nova, exemplified by composers like Francesco Landini and Jacopo da Bologna, adapted French techniques to Italian poetic forms and aesthetic preferences, creating distinctive national characteristics while maintaining connections to international stylistic developments. The English development of complex rhythmic techniques in works preserved in manuscripts like the Old Hall manuscript demonstrates independent innovation that paralleled and sometimes exceeded continental achievements in rhythmic sophistication. The emergence of the Ars Nova movement coincided with significant political and cultural changes in 14th-century Europe that created new contexts for musical innovation and patronage. The development of more centralized monarchical states, the growth of wealthy merchant classes, and the increasing sophistication of court culture created opportunities for musical experimentation and innovation that had been impossible in earlier periods. The political instability caused by events such as the 100 Years' War and the Black Death also influenced musical development by creating demand for music that addressed contemporary concerns and emotions. The relationship between Ars Nova innovation and contemporary developments in other arts reveals the integrated character of 14th-century cultural development. The parallels between rhythmic innovation in music and metric experimentation in vernacular poetry, the connections between musical notation and developments in visual representation, and the shared aesthetic values that characterize different artistic media demonstrate the unified character of late medieval cultural innovation. The interdisciplinary character of medieval intellectual life created conditions that supported simultaneous innovation across different artistic fields. The international political relationships of the 14th century facilitated the spread of Ars Nova innovations through diplomatic and military contacts that created opportunities for cultural exchange. The presence of French musicians at foreign courts, the circulation of musical manuscripts through diplomatic gift exchange, and the movement of composers in connection with political events all contributed to the rapid international dissemination of new musical techniques and aesthetic ideas. Instrumental music and medieval performance traditions. The development of instrumental music during the medieval period, while less well documented than vocal music due to the primarily oral tradition of instrumental performance, played an increasingly important role in medieval musical life. Instruments were categorized into two main groups: haute, loud, instruments suitable for outdoor performance, including trumpets, shawms and drums, and bas, soft, instruments appropriate for indoor use, such as lutes, viols, and recorders. The distinction between these categories reflected not only volume differences but also social functions, with haute instruments associated with ceremonial and public occasions, while bas instruments were preferred for intimate courtly entertainment. The technological development of medieval instruments reflects both indigenous innovation and cultural exchange through trade and warfare. The introduction of the lute from Islamic cultures transformed European string instrument traditions and provided new possibilities for both solo performance and accompaniment. The evolution of the viol from earlier fiddle types created instruments capable of sophisticated polyphonic performance that could support the complex musical textures being developed in vocal music. The development of keyboard instruments, particularly the organ and later the clavichord, established new possibilities for harmonic exploration that would prove crucial for later musical development. The construction and maintenance of medieval instruments required specialized craftsmanship that developed into organized guilds in major urban centers. The standardization of instrument construction within guild systems contributed to the development of consistent tuning systems and performance practices that facilitated ensemble playing and the exchange of musical repertoires between different regions. The economic importance of instrument making in medieval cities demonstrates the significant role of instrumental music in medieval cultural life, despite its limited representation in surviving written sources. The performance contexts for medieval instrumental music varied considerably depending on social circumstances and geographical location. Court entertainments required instruments capable of providing both dance music and accompaniment for vocal performances, leading to the development of diverse instrumental ensembles that combined instruments from different families. Religious ceremonies increasingly incorporated instrumental music, particularly organ accompaniment for choral performances, though the specific roles of instruments in liturgical contexts remain subjects of scholarly debate. Popular festivities and seasonal celebrations provided opportunities for instrumental performance that connected art music traditions with folk practices. Dance music formed a significant component of medieval instrumental repertoire, though much of it was never written down and has been lost to history. The estampi, one of the few medieval dance forms for which written examples survive, demonstrates the sophisticated rhythmic and formal structures that characterized medieval instrumental music. These dances often featured repeating sections with open and closed endings, creating formal patterns that would influence instrumental music well into the Renaissance period. The popularity of dance music at medieval courts fostered the development of instrumental techniques and encouraged the composition of purely instrumental works independent of vocal models. The relationship between vocal and instrumental music in medieval performance practice remains one of the most challenging aspects of historical reconstruction. The use of instruments to double vocal lines, provide textless accompaniment, or replace voices entirely in certain contexts created performance possibilities that are difficult to determine from surviving notational sources. The practice of entabulation, in which vocal compositions were adapted for instrumental performance, demonstrates active interchange between vocal and instrumental traditions that enriched both spheres of musical activity. The development of instrumental notation lagged significantly behind vocal notation, reflecting both the primarily oral character of instrumental traditions and the technical challenges of notating the ornaments and inflections that characterized instrumental performance. The emergence of tablature systems for specific instruments, particularly lutes and keyboards, provided specialized notational solutions that captured aspects of instrumental technique that were impossible to represent in standard mensural notation. These specialized notational systems contributed to the development of idiomatic instrumental styles that exploited the unique capabilities of specific instruments. The social status of instrumental performers varied considerably depending on their specific musical roles and institutional affiliations. Court musicians enjoyed relatively high status and economic security, while itinerant performers often faced social marginalization despite their musical skills. The emergence of urban musical guilds provided institutional support for professional instrumental performers and established standards for musical training and professional conduct that helped elevate the social status of musicians. The evolution of medieval instruments and their cultural significance. The medieval period witnessed remarkable innovations in instrument design and construction that reflected both technological advancement and changing musical needs. The development of the organ during the medieval period transformed both sacred and secular musical performance, creating possibilities for complex polyphonic realization that influenced compositional practices. Early medieval organs were relatively simple instruments with limited ranges and capabilities, but by the end of the period, they had evolved into sophisticated instruments capable of supporting elaborate polyphonic performances and providing rich harmonic foundations for choral music. The construction of medieval organs required collaboration between skilled craftsmen from various trades, including metalworkers, woodworkers, and leather workers, creating economic networks that supported technological innovation. The installation of organs in major churches and cathedrals represented significant financial investments that reflected the high cultural value placed on musical elaboration in liturgical contexts. The development of different organ types, from small portative organs suitable for processions to large stationary instruments designed for specific architectural spaces, demonstrates the adaptation of instrumental technology to diverse performance needs. String instruments underwent significant development during the medieval period, with innovations in construction techniques, playing methods, and musical applications that established foundations for later instrumental development. The evolution of bowed string instruments from simple fiddles to sophisticated viols capable of polyphonic performance reflects both technological advancement and changing musical demands. The development of fretted string instruments, particularly the lute family, created new possibilities for harmonic accompaniment and solo instrumental performance that influenced both vocal and instrumental compositional practices. The cultural significance of specific instruments in medieval society reveals important aspects of social organization and cultural values. Certain instruments became associated with particular social classes, with some reserved for noble entertainment and others associated with popular culture. The symbolic associations of different instruments in medieval art and literature provide insights into contemporary attitudes toward music and its social functions. The use of instruments in ceremonial contexts, from royal coronations to religious processions, demonstrates the integration of musical performance with political and spiritual authority. Wind instruments played important roles in medieval musical culture, particularly in outdoor ceremonial and military contexts where their volume and penetrating sound made them essential for effective musical communication. The development of reed instruments like shawms and bladder pipes created new possibilities for melodic performance in outdoor settings, while the evolution of brass instruments established traditions of ceremonial music that would continue throughout European history. The technical challenges of medieval wind instrument construction required specialized craftsmanship that developed into distinct trades with their own guild organizations and professional standards. Music theory and medieval intellectual traditions. The role of music in medieval education was closely tied to its classification as one of the 7 liberal arts, specifically as part of the quadrivium alongside arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. This academic framework, inherited from classical antiquity through the writings of Boethius and other theorists, emphasized the mathematical and philosophical aspects of music rather than its practical performance. Medieval music theory drew heavily on ancient Greek sources, particularly the works of Pythagoras and Ptolemy, adapting these classical concepts to the needs of Christian worship and medieval musical practice. The study of music as a mathematical discipline contributed to the development of sophisticated theoretical frameworks that supported the creation of increasingly complex polyphonic compositions. The Boethian tradition in medieval music theory established fundamental concepts that influenced musical thought throughout the medieval period and beyond. Boethius's De Institution Musica provided medieval theorists with a systematic approach to musical relationships based on mathematical proportions and cosmological symbolism. The 3 categories of music described by Boethius, musica mundana, cosmic music, musica humana, human music, and musica instrumentalis, instrumental music, created a hierarchical framework that placed practical music making within a larger philosophical and theological context. This theoretical foundation supported the medieval view of music as a reflection of divine harmony and cosmic order. The development of modal theory during the medieval period represented a crucial adaptation of ancient Greek theoretical concepts to the practical needs of Christian liturgical music. The systematization of the 8 church modes provided theoretical frameworks for understanding the melodic and harmonic characteristics of plain chant while supporting the development of polyphonic composition based on modal principles. Theorists like Hucbald of St. Amand and later Guido of Arezzo contributed to the refinement of modal theory and its practical application in composition and performance. The emergence of polyphonic theory during the High Medieval period required significant expansion of existing theoretical frameworks to accommodate the harmonic and contrapuntal relationships created by multiple simultaneous voices. The development of concepts of consonance and dissonance, the systematization of voice-leading principles, and the establishment of guidelines for acceptable harmonic progressions created theoretical foundations that supported increasingly sophisticated polyphonic composition. Treatises like the Ars Cantus Mensurabilis of Franco of Cologne provided practical guidelines for composers while maintaining connections to the broader philosophical foundations of medieval music theory. The integration of Aristotelian philosophy into medieval intellectual life during the 13th century influenced music theory through the incorporation of concepts of causality, substance, and form into discussions of musical structure and expression. The scholastic method of argumentation, with its emphasis on systematic logical development and the reconciliation of apparently contradictory authorities, provided new approaches to musical analysis that supported increasingly sophisticated theoretical discussions. The works of theorists like Johannes de Garlandia demonstrate the application of scholastic methodology to musical problems with remarkable intellectual rigor. The development of proportional theory in late medieval music theory reflected the continuing influence of mathematical concepts on musical thought while supporting the complex rhythmic innovations of Ars Nova composition. The systematic exploration of proportional relationships between different note values and the development of notational systems capable of representing complex proportions enabled composers to create works of unprecedented structural sophistication. The theoretical writings of Philippe de Vitry and later theorists established intellectual frameworks that supported the most advanced compositional techniques of the 14th century. The manuscript tradition of medieval music theory reveals the international character of medieval intellectual life and the processes by which theoretical innovations spread throughout Europe. The circulation of theoretical treatises through monastic and cathedral libraries created networks of intellectual exchange that facilitated the development and refinement of musical theory. The translation of theoretical works between Latin and vernacular languages made advanced musical concepts accessible to broader audiences and contributed to the development of national theoretical traditions. The relationship between music theory and practical composition in medieval culture demonstrates the integration of intellectual and artistic activity that characterized medieval educational institutions. The training of composers within cathedral and monastic schools required mastery of both theoretical principles and practical compositional skills, creating musicians capable of creating works that embodied sophisticated intellectual concepts while maintaining artistic appeal. The career patterns of major medieval composers, many of whom were also important theorists, illustrate the close connections between theoretical understanding and creative achievement. The philosophical foundations of medieval musical thought. The integration of music theory with broader philosophical and theological systems created intellectual frameworks that supported sophisticated understanding of musical expression and its relationship to human experience and divine truth. The medieval conception of music as a mathematical science connected musical study with fundamental questions about the nature of reality and knowledge, creating theoretical approaches that emphasized the cosmic and spiritual significance of musical relationships. This philosophical foundation influenced both theoretical development and compositional practice throughout the medieval period. The influence of Neoplatonic philosophy on medieval musical thought created approaches to musical analysis that emphasized the symbolic and allegorical dimensions of musical experience. The conception of musical harmony as a reflection of divine harmony influenced both theoretical speculation and practical composition, creating works that embodied complex philosophical and theological concepts through their structural and expressive characteristics. The integration of philosophical and musical thought created intellectual traditions that influenced musical development well beyond the medieval period. The development of systematic approaches to musical analysis during the medieval period established methodologies that influenced later musical scholarship and theoretical development. The application of logical principles derived from scholastic philosophy to musical problems created analytical frameworks that supported increasingly sophisticated understanding of musical structure and expression. The medieval emphasis on systematic classification and theoretical explanation established precedents for scientific approaches to musical study that continue to influence musicological research. Cultural exchange and international influences. The influence of Islamic musical culture on medieval European music, particularly in Iberia and southern Italy, provided important cross-cultural exchanges that enriched the development of Western musical traditions. The preservation and transmission of ancient Greek musical treatises through Arabic translations, along with the introduction of new instruments and theoretical concepts, contributed significantly to medieval musical development. Instruments such as the lute, derived from the Arabic oud, and the guitarn, ancestor of the guitar, entered European musical culture through these cross-cultural contacts, expanding the available instrumental palette and influencing compositional practices. The complex cultural interactions in medieval Iberia created unique musical syntheses that combined Islamic, Jewish, and Christian traditions in remarkable ways. The coexistence of these three religious communities, despite periodic conflicts, facilitated musical exchanges that enriched all participating traditions. The development of distinctive Iberian musical forms, such as the cantiga and the villancico, reflects the creative fusion of diverse musical influences that characterized medieval Spanish musical culture. The patronage of Alfonso X of Castile, whose court supported the creation of the cantigas de Santa Maria, demonstrates the potential for cross-cultural collaboration in medieval musical patronage. The Crusades, despite their military character, facilitated significant cultural exchanges that influenced European musical development. The exposure of Western Europeans to Eastern Christian and Islamic musical traditions during the crusading expeditions contributed to the introduction of new instruments, performance practices, and theoretical concepts. The establishment of crusader states in the Eastern Mediterranean created sustained opportunities for cultural interaction that continued beyond the military campaigns themselves. The influence of Byzantine musical traditions on Western polyphonic development, while difficult to document precisely, appears to have been significant in certain regional traditions. The international character of medieval university culture facilitated the exchange of musical ideas and theoretical concepts throughout Europe. The mobility of students and scholars between major university centers like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna created networks of intellectual exchange that transcended political boundaries. The standardization of Latin as the language of scholarly discourse enabled theoretical treatises to circulate widely and influence musical development across linguistic barriers. The incorporation of music into university curricula ensured that advanced musical concepts reached educated audiences throughout medieval Europe. The development of international Gothic architectural styles created acoustic environments that influenced musical composition and performance practices throughout Europe. The similar acoustic characteristics of Gothic cathedrals in different regions created shared performance contexts that supported the development of international musical styles. The patronage relationships between major religious institutions and composers created networks that facilitated the circulation of musical repertoires and the standardization of performance practices. Trade relationships between medieval European cities created opportunities for musical exchange that complemented the more formal channels of ecclesiastical and academic interaction. The presence of foreign merchants in major commercial centers introduced new musical instruments and performance traditions that influenced local musical development. The establishment of foreign merchant communities in major cities created diaspora musical cultures that maintained connections to their regions of origin while adapting to local conditions. The diplomatic relationships between medieval courts facilitated musical exchanges through the movement of musicians and musical manuscripts as part of diplomatic activities. The practice of exchanging musicians as diplomatic gifts created opportunities for direct transmission of musical techniques and repertoires between different royal courts. The celebration of diplomatic marriages and other ceremonial occasions required musical performances that often brought together musicians from different cultural traditions, creating opportunities for musical synthesis and innovation. The impact of pilgrimage routes on musical development. The medieval pilgrimage routes that connected distant regions of Europe created important channels for musical exchange that facilitated the spread of innovations and the development of international musical styles. The major pilgrimage destinations, particularly Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Jerusalem, attracted visitors from throughout Europe who carried musical traditions with them and returned home with new musical knowledge. The religious communities that supported pilgrimage activities created networks of cultural exchange that transcended political boundaries and facilitated musical communication across vast distances. The economic and social infrastructure required to support pilgrimage activities created opportunities for musical performance and cultural exchange in communities along major pilgrimage routes. The hospitality traditions associated with pilgrimage support required musical entertainment that brought together performers and audiences from different cultural backgrounds. The competitive environment created by the presence of musicians from various traditions stimulated innovation and encouraged the development of new musical styles that incorporated diverse influences. The musical traditions specifically associated with pilgrimage activities, including pilgrimage songs and liturgical music for special pilgrimage services, created repertoires that were transmitted throughout Europe through the movements of pilgrims and religious personnel. The international character of these repertoires contributed to the development of common musical practices that facilitated communication between musicians from different regions and cultural backgrounds. Monastic institutions and musical preservation. Monastic communities played a crucial role in the preservation and development of medieval music, serving as centers of musical learning and composition throughout the period. The daily cycle of monastic prayer, with its emphasis on sung liturgy, created a constant demand for musical innovation and refinement. Monasteries maintained scriptoria where musical manuscripts were copied and preserved, ensuring the survival of both sacred and secular repertoires. The educational systems developed within monastic communities produced many of the period's most important composers and theorists, creating networks of musical knowledge that extended across medieval Europe. The monastic emphasis on the spiritual significance of music created institutional contexts that supported both the preservation of traditional repertoires and the development of new musical forms. The Benedictine tradition, with its emphasis on the dignity of manual labor and intellectual activity, provided ideal conditions for the painstaking work of manuscript copying and musical composition. The establishment of scriptorium traditions within major monasteries ensured the survival of crucial musical texts while creating opportunities for scribal innovation in notational practices and manuscript organization. The international character of monastic orders facilitated the exchange of musical repertoires and practices between monasteries in different regions and countries. The Cluniac reform movement of the 10th and 11th centuries created standardized liturgical practices that were adopted throughout the Cluniac network, contributing to the development of unified musical traditions that transcended local variations. The Cistercian order's emphasis on simplicity and spiritual purity led to distinctive approaches to chant performance and composition that influenced musical development throughout Europe. The Dominican and Franciscan orders, emerging in the 13th century, brought new approaches to musical performance and composition that reflected their urban ministries and scholastic orientations. The preservation of musical manuscripts within monastic libraries created repositories of musical knowledge that sustained European musical culture through periods of political instability and cultural disruption. The careful maintenance of these collections by successive generations of monks ensured the survival of musical works that might otherwise have been lost to war, natural disasters, or cultural change. The cataloging and organization of these collections by medieval librarians created systematic approaches to musical scholarship that influenced later developments in musicology and historical research. The relationship between monastic musical traditions and secular musical development demonstrates the permeability of boundaries between sacred and secular culture in medieval society. The training of secular musicians within monastic schools created networks of influence that extended monastic musical practices into courtly and urban contexts. The adaptation of monastic compositional techniques for secular purposes contributed to the development of sophisticated secular musical forms that maintained connections to their sacred origins. The economic resources of major monasteries enabled them to support musical activities on a scale that was often impossible for secular institutions. The commissioning of luxury musical manuscripts, the maintenance of skilled scriptoriums, and the support of composer-theorists required significant financial investments that were feasible only for wealthy religious institutions. The economic stability of monastic institutions provided continuity that was essential for long-term musical development and preservation. The educational role of monasteries in training both religious and secular musicians created institutional frameworks that supported the transmission of musical knowledge across generations. The systematic approach to musical education developed within monastic schools, combining theoretical study with practical performance training, established pedagogical models that influenced musical education throughout medieval Europe. The production of educational treatises within monastic contexts contributed to the standardization of musical theory and practice that facilitated communication between musicians from different regions and traditions. The architectural influence on monastic musical practice. The architectural characteristics of medieval monastic churches created acoustic environments that profoundly influenced both the composition and performance of liturgical music. The long reverberation times and resonant stone construction of Romanesque and Gothic monastic churches shaped compositional techniques and performance practices in ways that became integral to medieval musical style. The relationship between architectural space and musical performance created acoustic partnerships that influenced the development of polyphonic techniques and choral practices throughout the medieval period. The design of monastic choir spaces reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between architectural form and musical function. The arrangement of choir stalls, the positioning of altars and lecterns, and the acoustic properties of different areas within monastic churches created performance environments that supported specific types of musical activity. The integration of architectural and musical planning in major monastic churches demonstrates the importance placed on creating optimal conditions for liturgical musical performance. The influence of monastic architectural acoustics extended beyond individual institutions through the circulation of architectural models and the training of architects who worked on multiple projects. The standardization of certain acoustic characteristics in monastic churches throughout Europe contributed to the development of consistent performance practices and compositional approaches that facilitated musical communication between different monastic communities. Regional variations and national characteristics. The development of secular polyphony during the late medieval period marked an important expansion of polyphonic techniques beyond their liturgical origins. Composers began applying the sophisticated compositional methods developed for sacred music to secular texts and forms, creating a rich repertoire of polyphonic chansons, ballades, and other secular genres. This development was facilitated by the growth of secular patronage, as wealthy nobles and merchants became increasingly interested in supporting musical composition and performance for their own entertainment and prestige. Regional variations in medieval musical development created distinct national and local traditions that contributed to the overall richness of the period's musical output. English music of the 14th and 15th centuries, exemplified by the Worcester fragments and the Old Hall manuscript, developed unique harmonic practices that distinguished it from continental European traditions. The English preference for fuller sonorities and more consonant harmonies influenced continental composers and contributed to the international style that would characterize music at the end of the medieval period. The distinctive characteristics of English medieval music emerged from a combination of indigenous traditions and continental influences that created unique syntheses not found elsewhere in Europe. The English predilection for thirds and sixths as consonant intervals, in contrast to continental preferences for fourths and fifths, created harmonic languages that sounded distinctly different from French or Italian music of the same period. The technique of gimel, in which a single melodic line was divided into two parallel voices moving primarily in thirds and sixths, represents a characteristically English approach to polyphonic composition that influenced later developments in continental music. The manuscript sources of English medieval music reveal performance traditions and compositional practices that illuminate the distinctive character of English musical culture. The Old Hall manuscript, compiled during the early 15th century, preserves works by English composers like Lionel Power and John Dunstable that demonstrate sophisticated applications of continental techniques to English aesthetic preferences. The international reputation of English composers during this period, evidenced by the preservation of their works in continental manuscripts, demonstrates the high artistic standards achieved by English medieval musicians. Italian musical development during the 14th century created distinctive traditions that paralleled and sometimes competed with French innovations in polyphonic composition. The Italian Ars Nova, represented by composers like Francesco Landini, Giovanni da Cassia, and Jacopo da Bologna, adapted French polyphonic techniques to Italian poetic forms and aesthetic preferences. The Italian preference for more lyrical melodic lines and clearer textual declamation created musical styles that differed significantly from the more abstract and rhythmically complex approaches favored by French composers. The development of distinctive Italian musical forms, such as the madrigal, ballata, and caccia, demonstrates the creative adaptation of international techniques to local cultural contexts. The 14th century madrigal, with its combination of poetic sophistication and musical complexity, established models of text-music relationships that would influence Italian musical development for centuries. The caccia, with its elaborate canonic structures and vivid textual imagery, represents one of the most distinctive achievements of Italian medieval composition. The German musical tradition during the medieval period developed along different lines from both French and Italian traditions, creating distinctive characteristics that reflected Germanic cultural values and aesthetic preferences. The Minnesang tradition adapted French troubadour models to German poetic and musical sensibilities, creating works that maintained connections to international courtly culture while expressing distinctively German characteristics. The development of German polyphonic traditions during the 14th and 15th centuries created musical styles that combined international techniques with indigenous formal and harmonic preferences. The preservation of German medieval music in manuscripts like the Codex Manesse and various liturgical sources reveals musical traditions that maintained distinctive characteristics while participating in international stylistic developments. The German approach to polyphonic composition often favored clearer textual relationships and more systematic formal organization than was typical of French or Italian music of the same period. The influence of German theoretical traditions on practical composition created works that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mathematical and proportional relationships in musical structure. Spanish musical development during the medieval period reflected the complex cultural interactions between Christian, Islamic, and Jewish communities that characterized medieval Iberian society. The distinctive characteristics of Spanish medieval music emerged from these cross-cultural influences while maintaining connections to broader European musical developments. The Cantigas de Santa Maria, compiled under the patronage of Alfonso X of Castile, represents one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval Spanish musical culture, combining sophisticated poetic and musical techniques with distinctive Iberian characteristics. The Celtic musical tradition and its European influence. The Celtic musical traditions of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany maintained distinctive characteristics throughout the medieval period while participating in broader European musical developments. The preservation of ancient Celtic musical practices within monastic communities created unique syntheses of indigenous and continental traditions that influenced broader European musical development. The Irish monastic tradition, in particular, played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting musical knowledge during periods of political instability and cultural disruption on the European mainland. The distinctive characteristics of Celtic musical traditions, including specific melodic formulas, rhythmic patterns, and performance practices, contributed to the development of regional musical styles that maintained connections to pre-Christian cultural traditions while adapting to Christian liturgical needs. The influence of Celtic musical elements on broader European traditions can be traced through specific compositional techniques and melodic characteristics that appear in continental manuscripts and theoretical treatises. The role of Irish and Scottish monks in the preservation and transmission of musical knowledge throughout medieval Europe created networks of cultural exchange that facilitated the spread of Celtic musical influences. The establishment of Irish and Scottish monastic communities throughout continental Europe provided channels for cultural transmission that continued throughout the medieval period and contributed to the international character of medieval musical culture. Manuscript traditions and musical preservation. The manuscript tradition of medieval music provides invaluable insights into the performance practices and cultural contexts of the period's musical repertoire. Major manuscripts such as the Montpellier Codex, the Roman de Fauvel, and the Chantilly Codex preserve not only musical notation but also decorative elements and textual materials that illuminate the social and cultural functions of medieval music. The organization and presentation of these manuscripts reveal important information about the intended performance contexts and the relationships between different musical genres and styles. The production of medieval musical manuscripts required specialized skills and significant economic resources that were available only to wealthy institutions and individuals. The collaboration between scribes, illuminators, and musical editors in creating these manuscripts demonstrates the high cultural value placed on musical preservation and the sophisticated organizational systems required for large-scale manuscript production. The standardization of manuscript formats and organizational principles facilitated the circulation and use of musical collections throughout medieval Europe. The paleographical study of medieval musical manuscripts reveals important information about notational practices, regional traditions, and the historical development of specific musical repertoires. The analysis of scribal hands and notational characteristics enables scholars to identify the origins and dating of musical sources with considerable precision. The study of manuscript corrections and annotations provides insights into medieval performance practices and the ways in which musical works were adapted for different performance contexts. The decorative programs of luxury musical manuscripts demonstrate the integration of musical and visual arts in medieval culture and the symbolic meanings attributed to musical performance. The illuminations in manuscripts like the Chantilly Codex and the Squarcialupi Codex create visual representations of musical performance that complement and enhance the written musical notation. The iconographic analysis of these decorative elements provides important information about medieval attitudes toward music and its role in both sacred and secular contexts. The circulation patterns of medieval musical manuscripts reveal networks of cultural exchange and influence that connected distant regions and institutions. The presence of French compositions in English manuscripts, Italian works in German sources, and other cross-cultural transmissions demonstrates the international character of late medieval musical culture. The study of manuscript provenance and ownership histories illuminates the social and economic systems that supported musical patronage and preservation. The survival patterns of medieval musical manuscripts reflect both historical accidents and systematic preservation efforts that have shaped our understanding of medieval musical culture. The preservation of certain repertoires in multiple sources while others survive in unique manuscripts creates an uneven representation of medieval musical achievement that requires careful scholarly interpretation. The loss of entire categories of medieval music, particularly popular and instrumental traditions that were rarely written down, represents a significant gap in our understanding of medieval musical life. The relationship between musical manuscripts and performance practice remains one of the most challenging aspects of medieval musical scholarship. The notation preserved in medieval manuscripts often provides incomplete information about rhythm, ornamentation, and other performance details that were presumably supplied by informed performers. The reconstruction of medieval performance practices requires careful analysis of notational evidence combined with broader knowledge of medieval musical theory and cultural context. The economics of manuscript production and distribution. The economic systems that supported medieval manuscript production reveal important aspects of medieval society and cultural values. The substantial costs associated with parchment, inks, and skilled labor made manuscript production a significant investment that required wealthy patrons or institutional support. The economic analysis of manuscript production provides insights into the social and cultural priorities of medieval patrons and the economic networks that supported cultural activities. The development of commercial manuscript production in major urban centers during the later medieval period created new opportunities for musical preservation and circulation. The emergence of professional scriptoria that produced manuscripts for sale rather than institutional use reflected changing economic conditions and cultural values that supported broader access to musical texts. The standardization of commercial manuscript production contributed to the development of more uniform notational practices and manuscript formats. The international trade in musical manuscripts created networks of cultural exchange that facilitated the spread of musical innovations throughout medieval Europe. The circulation of manuscripts through commercial channels complemented the more formal exchange systems associated with diplomatic and ecclesiastical relationships, creating multiple pathways for cultural transmission. The economic analysis of manuscript circulation patterns reveals the extent and character of international cultural relationships in medieval Europe. The transition to Renaissance musical styles. The transition from medieval to Renaissance musical styles occurred gradually over the course of the 15th century, with composers like John Dunstable in England and Guillaume Dufay on the continent pioneering new approaches to harmony, text setting, and formal organization. These transitional figures maintained connections to medieval traditions while introducing innovations that would define Renaissance musical practice. The increasing emphasis on textual clarity, harmonic consonance, and formal balance marked the beginning of a new era in Western music history, though many medieval techniques and principles continued to influence composers well into the Renaissance period. The compositional innovations that characterized the transition from medieval to Renaissance styles reflected changing cultural values and aesthetic preferences that emphasized humanism, individual expression, and textual clarity over the more abstract and symbolically oriented approaches of medieval composition. The development of Foxborden technique by English composers created new approaches to harmonic writing that influenced continental composers throughout the 15th century. The systematic use of thirds and sixths as consonant intervals transformed harmonic language and contributed to the development of tonal relationships that would eventually lead to the major-minor system. The influence of humanist thought on musical composition during the early Renaissance period created new approaches to text-music relationships that emphasized clear textual declamation and expressive word painting. The revival of interest in classical Latin poetry and rhetoric influenced composers to develop more sophisticated approaches to musical rhetoric that paralleled developments in literary and oratorical theory. The integration of humanist educational ideals into musical training created composers who were equipped to address both technical and expressive challenges with unprecedented sophistication. The development of new compositional genres during the transitional period reflected changing social contexts and patronage systems that supported different types of musical expression. The emergence of the Renaissance mass cycle as a major compositional form built upon medieval precedents while introducing new approaches to structural unity and harmonic organization. The development of secular polyphonic forms that combined sophisticated musical techniques with vernacular texts created new opportunities for expressive composition that addressed broader audiences than traditional Latin sacred music. The technological innovations of the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, particularly the development of music printing, transformed the circulation and preservation of musical works in ways that had profound implications for musical development. The ability to produce multiple copies of musical works with relative ease facilitated the development of international musical styles and enabled composers to reach audiences throughout Europe. The standardization of musical notation through printing technology contributed to the development of more unified performance practices and theoretical understanding. The institutional changes that characterized the transition from medieval to Renaissance culture created new contexts for musical composition and performance that influenced the development of new musical styles. The growth of secular courts as centers of musical patronage created opportunities for composers to develop secular musical forms that competed with traditional sacred genres for cultural prestige. The emergence of urban musical institutions, including guilds and confraternities, created new performance contexts that required different types of musical composition. The international circulation of musicians during the 15th century created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and stylistic synthesis that contributed to the development of international Renaissance musical styles. The presence of Northern European composers in Italian courts, the influence of Italian musical practices on Northern European traditions, and the circulation of musical manuscripts throughout Europe created conditions for rapid stylistic development and innovation. The enduring legacy of medieval music. The legacy of medieval music extends far beyond its immediate historical period, establishing fundamental principles of Western musical composition and theory that continue to influence music to this day. The development of polyphony during the medieval period created the foundation for all subsequent Western art music, while the notation systems developed during this era provided the basic framework for musical literacy that remains largely unchanged. Medieval music's emphasis on the mathematical and philosophical aspects of musical composition contributed to the intellectual tradition that would support the great achievements of Renaissance and later composers. The theoretical foundations established during the medieval period continue to influence musical education and composition in ways that are often taken for granted. The staff notation system, the basic principles of rhythm and meter, the concept of harmonic consonance and dissonance, and the fundamental approaches to polyphonic voice leading all derive from medieval innovations that have proven remarkably durable. The integration of practical musical skills with theoretical understanding that characterized medieval musical education established pedagogical models that continue to influence musical training. The repertoire of medieval music that has survived provides modern performers and audiences with access to musical traditions that offer distinctive aesthetic experiences unavailable in later musical styles. The performance of medieval music by early music specialists has created new appreciation for the sophistication and beauty of medieval musical achievement while contributing to broader understanding of musical history and development. The influence of medieval music on contemporary composers demonstrates the continuing vitality of medieval musical concepts and techniques. The social functions of medieval music reveal important aspects of medieval culture and society, from the role of music in religious worship to its use in courtly entertainment and popular celebration. The integration of music into virtually all aspects of medieval life, from the daily prayers of monastic communities to the elaborate ceremonies of royal courts, demonstrates the central importance of musical expression in medieval culture. This integration created a rich and diverse musical landscape that encompassed both the most sophisticated artistic achievements and the simplest folk expressions. The study of medieval music continues to contribute to broader understanding of medieval culture and society through analysis of musical texts, performance contexts, and patronage systems. The interdisciplinary approach required for medieval musical scholarship, combining musicology with history, theology, literature, and art history, has contributed to more sophisticated understanding of medieval culture as a complex and integrated whole. The preservation and study of medieval musical sources continues to reveal new aspects of medieval musical achievement and to challenge earlier assumptions about medieval cultural development. The performance practices of medieval music, while often difficult to reconstruct with complete accuracy, provide fascinating insights into the acoustic and social environments in which this music was created and performed. The architectural settings of medieval churches and courts, with their distinctive acoustic properties, shaped both the compositional techniques and performance practices of the period. The relationship between performers and audiences in medieval musical culture differed significantly from modern concert traditions, with music serving functional as well as aesthetic purposes in most contexts. The continuing scholarly investigation of medieval music through analysis of newly discovered sources, application of new analytical techniques, and interdisciplinary collaboration continues to reveal new aspects of medieval musical achievement. The digitization of medieval musical manuscripts has made these sources more widely accessible to scholars and performers, facilitating new discoveries and interpretations. The development of historically informed performance practice has created new opportunities for experiencing medieval music in ways that approximate original performance conditions. The influence of medieval musical concepts on the development of later musical styles can be traced through specific compositional techniques, theoretical concepts, and aesthetic principles that were transmitted from medieval to Renaissance and later musical traditions. The evolution of polyphonic composition from medieval organum through Renaissance counterpoint to Baroque fugue demonstrates the continuous development of techniques that originated in medieval musical practice. The continuing influence of modal concepts on tonal harmony and the persistence of medieval formal principles in later musical styles illustrate the deep connections between medieval and later musical traditions. The technological innovations of medieval music, particularly in notation and instrument construction, established precedents that influenced musical development for centuries. The basic principles of musical notation established during the medieval period provided the foundation for all subsequent developments in musical writing and communication. The instrument families that developed during the medieval period established categories and performance traditions that continue to influence musical instrument design and performance practice. The international character of medieval musical development, despite the political fragmentation of medieval Europe, established precedents for musical exchange and synthesis that continue to characterize Western musical culture. The networks of cultural communication that facilitated the spread of musical innovations during the medieval period established patterns of musical influence and adaptation that have continued to shape musical development. The medieval synthesis of diverse cultural influences into coherent musical styles provided models for later periods of musical innovation and cultural exchange. The aesthetic principles that guided medieval musical composition, with their emphasis on mathematical proportion, symbolic meaning, and spiritual significance, continue to influence musical thought and composition in various ways. The medieval integration of intellectual and artistic concerns in musical composition established traditions of musical scholarship and analysis that continue to influence both academic and practical approaches to musical understanding. The medieval conception of music as a reflection of cosmic harmony and divine order provided philosophical foundations for musical aesthetics that continue to resonate in various forms. The preservation and transmission of medieval musical knowledge through manuscript traditions, theoretical treatises, and institutional practices established models for musical scholarship and preservation that continue to influence how musical culture is maintained and transmitted. The medieval emphasis on the educational and spiritual value of musical study contributed to the development of musical institutions and practices that continue to support musical culture. The medieval integration of musical practice with broader educational and intellectual traditions established precedents for the role of music in education and cultural development that continue to influence educational philosophy and practice. In conclusion, medieval music represents one of the most foundational periods in the development of Western musical culture, establishing techniques, concepts, and traditions that continue to influence musical development to the present day. The remarkable achievements of medieval composers, theorists, and performers created a musical heritage of extraordinary richness and sophistication that continues to reward study and performance. The ongoing scholarly and practical engagement with medieval musical traditions ensures that this remarkable cultural achievement continues to contribute to contemporary musical life and understanding.